Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your intellectual curiosity, feed it a whole stack of sources, and distill it all down into the most important and often the most surprising insights.
That's right. And today, we are taking a deep philosophical journey. We're going back to 19th century New England, Concord, Massachusetts, to be specific.
We are tackling Henry David Thoreau, a man who I think we can agree has been tragically simplified over the years.
Oh, absolutely. We tend to reduce him to just the guy who lived in a cabin. And our sources make it so clear that he was so much more than that. He wasn't some eccentric hermit.
Not at all.
He was a central, and I'd say a fiery figure in American philosophy, a leading light of Transcendentalist, and really a foundational thinker whose ideas on politics and the environment are still reshaping our world today.
So our mission for you, the learner, is to go beyond the greatest hits, beyond Walden, beyond civil disobedience. We want to uncover the truly surprising parts of his life.
Yeah, we want to look at the technical genius, the fierce political radicalism, and his incredible intellectual reach. I mean, this is a man who connects the dots between making pencils and the spiritual depth of Indian philosophy.
And that journey really starts with this core paradox that seems to define everything he did. He gave us these two world-changing contributions, and they seem to pull in completely opposite directions.
They really do. On one hand, you have Walden. This serene, deeply personal reflection on simple living, on solitude,
Also the other.
civil disobedience, a searing blueprint for mass political action, for public resistance against the state. So the question becomes, how does the ultimate hermit, the guy who argues for radical withdrawal, become one of the greatest architects of global protest?
That's the conflict. That's what we need to explore.
Right.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this maybe with something as basic as his name. We all know him as Henry David Thoreau, but the sources give us this wonderful little detail. He was actually born David Henry Thoreau. It was only after college that he just decided he preferred Henry David.
He just flipped it. It's a purely self-will thing. No legal petition. He just asserted his preference and started signing his name that way. It's like a tiny early act of civil disobedience against convention.
And speaking of conventions, we should probably clarify the pronunciation of his last name, because while we all say Thoreau today,
Right. Stress on the second syllable.
contemporaries in 19th century New England would have said it more like Thoreau.
Or even Thoreau. And that little detail, that fluidity and self-determination right down to his name,
Yeah.
it's just the perfect entry point, isn't it?
It really is. So that sets the stage beautifully for part one. His formation as this unconventional thinker. He was born in Concord, Massachusetts, into a pretty modest family.
Yeah, his father, John Thoreau, was a pencil maker. This wasn't a life of wealth or high society. It was about practical craft, New England ingenuity.
And there's a crucial piece of context here that I think informs everything he writes later. And that's the profound role of mortality in his early life.
The sources really hammer this home. The inescapable presence of tuberculosis, or consumption, as they called it. It was rampant, and it just devastated his family.
His older sister, Helen, died at 37.
His younger sister, Sophia, at 56. And of course, it's what ultimately claimed Henry David himself at only 44 years old.
And the trauma didn't stop there. Maybe the most defining death was his older brother, John Jr.
Oh, that story is just heartbreaking. He died at 27 from tetanus, after a shaving cut, of all things. A tiny, minor cut.
And he died in Henry's arms. That must have been a profoundly scarring, galvanizing event. This constant brush with the brevity of life, it puts so much urgency into Walden.
It absolutely does. When he demands that we live deliberately and capture the essential facts of life, you realize it's not just a philosophical exercise. It's a race against the clock for him.
And there's another family quirk we should mention. None of the 4 Thoreau children ever married.
Right, which created this very close-knit, highly focused, and you can say a somewhat sequestered intellectual environment.
But that rebellious streak, the seed of his political action, it was in the family DNA before him. The sources point to his maternal grandfather, Asa Dunbar.
Ah, the Butter Rebellion. This is a fantastic anecdote.
It really is.
And it wasn't just some minor squabble at Harvard in 1766. This was the first recorded student protest in the American colonies.
Over butter.
Over rancid butter. The students were protesting the quality of the food. Dunbar led them in a statement demanding better conditions. It seems small, but it establishes a family precedent. When your conscience is violated, even by bad butter, you have to protest.
So that principled protest was just baked into his lineage. It's no surprise then that when Henry David gets to Harvard, he ends his academic career with a similar though maybe more famous, refusal, the diploma story.
Yes, the classic rejection of institutional pomp. He refused to pay the $5 fee for his master's diploma.
Which was a lot of money back then. Over $150 today.
A huge sum. And when asked why, he gives that perfect piece of Thoreauvian wit. He references the sheepskin vellum and says, "Let every sheep keep its own skin."
It's such a perfect line. It just encapsulates his whole worldview, a complete rejection of external validation. It signals he's not going to follow the conventional path, not law, not the church, not business.
And you see this nonconformity immediately in his very short teaching career. He gets a job at a public school in Concord, but resigns almost right away
Why?
because he refused to administer corporal punishment. It was a lightning-fast, principled decision that cost him a steady job. A profound rejection of institutional violence.
So after that, he and his brother John start their own school, the Concord Academy.
And it was truly progressive for 1838. They introduced concepts like nature walks, field trips to local businesses. It was all about direct observation over rote memorization. They were already living the Transcendentalist belief that truth is found out in the world, not just in books.
And all this intellectual life in Concord, it naturally brings him into the orbit of the town's giant, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Right. Emerson was 14 years older, and he takes this keen, almost paternal interest in Thoreau. He sees his sharp intellect, his practical genius, and introduces him to the whole Transcendentalist circle.
Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne.
The heavy hitters, the minds that were shaping American thought.
So let's pause here and make sure we all understand what Transcendentalism actually means for Thoreau's daily philosophy.
So the core belief is that an ideal spiritual state transcends, it goes beyond the physical sensory world. And you find this truth not through church dogma or strict logic, but through your own personal intuition.
So in practice, nature becomes his temple.
His temple, his Bible, his laboratory, all in one. If he wants to find truth, he goes outside, not to a church pew. Emerson said that there was a radical correspondence of visible things and human thoughts.
And Thoreau didn't just read that theory. He made his entire life an experiment to prove it.
Exactly. And the central tool for that experiment was his journal. He started it in 1837 at Emerson's suggestion. And you have to understand, this wasn't a casual diary.
No, it became this monumental 2 million-word document that he kept for 24 years.
It was his laboratory for everything. For philosophy, for meteorological data, for botanical findings, for his political critiques. It's where he processed why things mattered.
Okay, now we have to get into the big contradiction. The image of the nature poet versus the industrious inventor and pencil manufacturer.
This is what gives him the moral authority to critique industrial society later. He wasn't some outsider. He worked in the family pencil factory, and for a lot of his adult life, he was basically the head of R&D.
And the factory was struggling at first, right? They were using inferior graphite.
They were. And Thoreau solves this technical problem. He resurrects the Conté process, a French invention, which involves using clay as a binder for the graphite.
So he's grinding graphite, mixing it with clay, firing it. This is chemistry.
It's chemical engineering. This is not the work of a starry-eyed dreamer. It's complex material science. And this is the man who is about to advocate stripping life down to its simplest terms.
And his technical work didn't even stop there.
No. Later, as the pencil market got saturated, he converted the factory to produce plumbago. That's just another name for graphite, for the electrotyping process, a cutting-edge 19th century technology for mass publishing.
So he was involved in both artisanal craft and advanced industrial tech. This is so important. He wasn't against technology itself.
No, he was against this system where workers were reduced to cogs in a machine just to enrich corporations. He knew the individual could master these things, and he felt the modern system was preventing that.
All this practicality, this intellectual restlessness, it sets the stage for the most famous experiment in American history.
He felt this deep spiritual need for a change. And he gets a push from his friend, Ellery Channing, who tells him to build yourself a hut and begin the grand process of devouring yourself alive.
And so he does. On July 4th, 1845, a date that is clearly symbolic, he begins his experiment.
2 years, 2 months, and 2 days of simple living.
Now, it's important to clarify the location because this gets at one of the common critiques of Walden, the idea that he wasn't really isolated.
Right. He built his house on Emerson's land near Walden Pond, but it was only about 1.5 miles from his family's home in Concord.
And that 1.5 miles is everything.
It is. He wasn't trying to escape humanity. He was setting up a vantage point. He was engaging with civilization, but from a carefully chosen critical distance. It wasn't about being a hermit. It was about defining the necessary interaction between a person and society.
And his motivation is maybe the most famous statement of philosophical intent in American literature. Let's really dive into that quote from Walden.
He writes, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived."
That word, deliberately, it's not a vacation. It's a carefully structured scientific and spiritual regime.
And he wasn't just looking for peace and quiet. He wanted to suck out all the marrow of life. He said if life proved to be mean, he wanted to know the whole and genuine meanness of it. That's a desire for raw data applied to existence itself.
The literary output from this time was just transformative. He finished his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, an elegy to his late brother.
And Walden itself was a masterpiece of revision. He takes those 2+ years and condenses them into a single symbolic calendar year structured around the 4 seasons to represent human development.
But this deliberate contemplative life is, well, it's sharply interrupted by an encounter with the state, his famous arrest.
Yes. July 1846, he's stopped by the local tax collector, Sam Staples, and arrested for refusing to pay 6 years of delinquent poll taxes. Spends 1 night in jail.
So why the refusal? It wasn't about money.
No, this was a profoundly calculated act. It was a protest against 2 things he saw as linked: the Mexican-American War and slavery.
He saw the war as just a land grab to expand slave territory.
Exactly. He called it a slave power conspiracy, and he simply refused to fund it. Paying even a few cents to a government engaged in immoral acts made him, in his mind, an accomplice.
And he only spent 1 night in jail.
Right, because someone, most likely his very conventional Aunt Maria, paid the tax against his wishes. And he was furious. It undermined the whole point of his protest.
But that 1 night in jail propelled him to write what became one of the most significant political essays ever.
Resistance to Civil Government, which we all now know as civil disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
The philosophy here is just foundational. He argues for the moral imperative of citizen disobedience against an unjust state. The highest authority is your own conscience, not the law.
But he wasn't calling for anarchy, was he? He asks for not at once no government, but at once a better government.
That's right. He saw government as progressing toward a true respect for the individual. He believed the state's authority had to come from the consent of the individual. And when the state violates your moral conscience, you can't just wait for an election. You have to withdraw your cooperation immediately.
Okay, this brings up a crucial point that's often misunderstood, especially since Gandhi and King used his essay as a blueprint for nonviolence. Was Thoreau himself a strict pacifist?
That's a profoundly important question. And the answer is, well, definitively no. Not in the absolute sense. He was actually against the idea of pacifist non-resistance if it led to moral passivity.
He wanted a more vigorous morality.
He did. He wrote that peace shouldn't be proclaimed by the rust on our swords, but by keeping them bright and sharp. He demanded an active moral stance.
And there's a concrete example of this from even earlier in his life, isn't there?
Yes, in a formal debate in 1841, years before the essay, he argued the affirmative side on the question, is it ever proper to offer forcible resistance?
That's significant. It shows he was open to resistance taking different forms. This complex position advocating nonviolent tax refusal, while also arguing that force might be proper, it really sets us up for his later uncompromising defense of John Brown.
Absolutely. The Walden years create this seamless whole. A philosophy of self-governance in Walden logically extends to political non-cooperation and civil disobedience. If you are the source of moral truth, you have to resist anything that compromises that truth.
So let's move into part 3, where we see him evolve after Walden. He becomes this dedicated natural scientist, a fiery political activist, and a kind of spiritual explorer.
The 1850s, the last decade of his life, were his years of obsessive observation. He worked as a land surveyor, which meant he had this intimate, practical knowledge of the conquered landscape.
And he wasn't just, rambling in the woods. He was systematically collecting data. He's reading Darwin. He's reading Humboldt. He kept these detailed records of everything from when fruit ripened to the water levels in Walden Pond.
His goal, he said, was to anticipate the seasons. This was systematic, proto-scientific data collection. He wasn't just describing nature lyrically. He was analyzing ecological patterns.
Which is why his lecture, The Succession of Forest Trees, is considered such a huge contribution to ecology.
It really is. He was challenging the conventional wisdom about how forests regenerate after being cleared. People assumed the same species would just grow back.
And he proved otherwise.
He did. He used analysis and experimentation to show that new trees, like pines, often replaced hardwoods because their seeds were dispersed by wind, water, and, crucially, by animals.
Which brings us to the famous squirrel story. It's such a beautiful illustration of his systems thinking.
It is. He observed that squirrels carry nuts far from the parent tree to create these little stashes. If the squirrel dies or forgets the stash, those nuts germinate. And Thoreau concludes the squirrel is performing a great service in the economy of the universe.
It's not just a cute animal, it's an integral part of forest generation.
He sees the interconnectedness. Everything, even the tiny movements of a squirrel, is significant and deliberate.
And that same deliberate, principled action extends directly to his political life, which only got more intense after he left Walden.
He became a fierce abolitionist. And it wasn't just a philosophical stance. He was taking huge risks.
The sources say he was an active conductor on the Underground Railroad. That was a serious, dangerous commitment.
Absolutely. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made aiding runaway slaves a federal crime, even in a free state like Massachusetts. He was risking jail, severe fines. This is the practical application of civil disobedience in its most high-stakes form.
And his radicalism really culminates in his defense of John Brown after the Harper's Ferry raid in 1859.
This was a moment when a lot of people, even moderate abolitionists, distanced themselves from Brown. They saw him as a violent fanatic.
But not Thoreau.
Thoreau would have none of it. He writes a plea for Captain John Brown, and he uncompromisingly defends Brown's actions and his character. He attacked the public for what he saw as their moral cowardice.
And he didn't just offend him, he elevated him. He used these staggering religious analogies.
He did. He compared the U.S. government executing Brown to Pontius Pilate and likened Brown's execution to the crucifixion of Christ. He wrote, "Some 1,800 years ago Christ was crucified. This morning, perchance, Captain Brown was hung. These are the two ends of a chain which is not without its links."
That must have been shocking for his audience to hear.
Incredibly controversial. It cemented his reputation as this uncompromising, almost hostile political voice. It showed he believed that resistance to a fundamental evil like slavery could justify extreme, even violent means.
Let's pivot to his views on civilization and commerce, which are just full of ambiguity. He advocated simple living, saying most luxuries are positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind.
And this led to specific personal practices. He preferred a mostly vegetarian diet, not so much for modern ethical reasons, but more as a form of philosophical self-purification. It was cleaner, simpler.
And with the larger economy, he seems to swing between admiration and contempt.
He did. He loved the idea of commerce. He even appreciated the freight train, saying it made him feel more like a citizen of the world, reminding him of coral reefs and Indian oceans.
So he's not a Luddite who just hates the railroad.
Not at all. He hated what the railroad facilitated. He hated the factory system, which he believed existed only to enrich corporations, not to honestly clad mankind. He was always seeking a middle ground, a partially cultivated country, not total wilderness.
And his intellectual world wasn't confined to New England either. Let's talk about his deep engagement with Indian spiritual thought. This is fascinating.
This is a key part of the Transcendentalist movement. They were actively seeking alternatives to Protestant orthodoxy, and texts from India provided that. Thoreau was profoundly influenced by the Bhagavad Gita.
And he captures this spiritual kinship so beautifully in Walden in the chapter The Pond in Winter.
It's a stunning passage. He talks about bathing his intellect in the philosophy of the Gita in the morning, that he goes to his well for water and imagines meeting a servant of a Brahmin priest drawing water from the sacred Ganges River. And he says, "Our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges."
Wow. It's a moment of spiritual globalism, linking his tiny experiment to this vast ancient tradition.
And it wasn't just abstract. The sources say he followed some Hindu customs, like a diet heavy in rice and playing the flute. He even wrote to a friend about yoga, saying, "Even I am a yogi."
Okay, finally, in this section, we need to touch on the theories about his very private personality. He never married, no children.
Right, and it's been a lifelong mystery. Scholars have debated whether he was heterosexual, homosexual, or asexual. The one thing we know is there's no historical evidence of physical relations with anyone. His friend Bronson Alcott said Thoreau seemed to have no temptations.
And yet, People point to homoerotic sentiments in his writing.
They do. There's his Elegy Sympathy, written for an 11-year-old boy. And more famously, in Walden, there's this long, elaborate praise of the woodchopper Alexarian, where he compares their friendship to Achilles and Patroclus. It points to this intense, emotional interior life that he kept very, very private.
And then there's the more modern theory, looking at him through the lens of neurodiversity, the idea that Thoreau might have been on the autism spectrum.
This is a really robust area of speculation, especially within the autistic community, and the traits they cite align very strongly.
Such as?
Well, first, his documented social difficulties and his intense need for solitude. Second, his insistence on strict routines and sameness. The simple diet, limited wardrobe, the Spartan living space.
So his famous self-sufficiency could be seen as a behavioral manifestation of a need for consistency.
Precisely. And third, the intense restrictive interests. His obsessive, systematic cataloging of Concord's nature is a perfect example of that kind of deep, narrow focus. Viewing him this way helps us understand his radical individualism, not as misanthropy, but maybe as a necessary accommodation to a world that was often overwhelming for him.
What a stunningly complex portrait. Let's move to part 4, where we explore the irony of his posthumous fame, because it's staggering that his political writings had almost zero influence during his lifetime.
It's one of history's great paradoxes. He dies in 1862, and he's seen by his contemporaries as just a naturalist, a bit of an eccentric one. Civil disobedience was basically ignored.
The rise of the Thoreau cult, as it was called, only began decades later, in the 1880s and 90s. But it was the global impact of civil disobedience that really cemented his legacy.
And that legacy is defined by these titans who changed the 20th century. Leo Tolstoy, Mohandas Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr.
Let's start with Gandhi because that connection is so direct.
Right. Gandhi first reads Civil Disobedience while he's in a South African prison, protesting discrimination. And the essay gives him this unshakable philosophical justification for his actions. He called its logic unanswerable.
And he actually took the name for his movement from Thoreau's essay.
He confirmed it. The core concepts of his movement, satyagraha or truth force, came from the ideas in On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. So a man who distrusted mass movements gives the intellectual framework for the largest nonviolent mass movement in history.
It's incredible, and Martin Luther King Jr. had a similar experience.
He did. King said reading the essay in 1944 was his first real encounter with the theory of nonviolent resistance.
He wrote that Thoreau convinced him that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good.
All the core tenets of the civil rights movement, the non-cooperation, the moral obligation, the passive resistance to unjust laws, you can trace them right back to Thoreau's night in jail in 1846.
And beyond these political giants, his influence is just so wide-ranging. He influenced people all across the political spectrum.
It's the ultimate paradox of his individualism. You have Emma Goldman, the great anarchist, calling him the greatest American anarchist. And then on the other side, you have Murray Rothbard, the founder of anarcho-capitalism, calling him a great intellectual hero.
How can both claim him?
Because his core principle is the radical rejection of state coercion and the elevation of the individual conscience. That idea appeals equally to those who want collective self-governance and those who want maximum economic freedom.
And of course, there's environmentalism, John Muir, E.O. Wilson, even psychology with B.F. Skinner's Walden Pond.
And the arts. The composer Charles Ives has that profound Concord sonata with a whole movement dedicated to Thoreau. His life just resonated across every discipline.
Despite all this reverence, we have to talk about the serious, sustained criticism he faced. A lot of his own contemporaries really disliked him.
They did. James Russell Lowell, a very influential critic, just savaged him after his death, called him a humorless poser, a sentimentalist, Diogenes in his barrel.
Robert Louis Stevenson called him a skulker who was afraid of the world.
Yeah, accused him of cowardice, basically. And the poet John Greenleaf Whittier detested Walden. He said Thoreau wanted man to lower himself to the level of a woodchuck.
The core of all this criticism seems to be the same. They saw his self-sufficiency as misanthropy, as selfishness, as hypocrisy.
Right, and that's a perpetual tension, isn't it? The fact that he was only a mile and a half from his mom's house and would go over for dinner.
Exactly. How do you reconcile that?
Well, Thoreau never denied it. He never pretended he'd completely abandoned society. He argued the spiritual cost of paying for his mother's cooking was lower than the spiritual cost of working for filthy money to buy it himself. He saw it as an experiment for mankind's benefit, not a retreat from it.
And he actually addresses this criticism head-on in Walden, doesn't he?
He does. He defends himself by saying he's confined to this theme by the narrowness of my experience. He says he just wants every writer to give a simple and sincere account of his own life. And he ends with that great defense. He trusts the coat will fit him whom it fits.
He knew his model wasn't for everyone, but that didn't invalidate the exploration for those who needed the blueprint.
And that's the counter-argument today. Critiques of hypocrisy are often seen as highly selective. The point wasn't to offer a universal prescription, but a radical example of how deep personal commitment could yield independence.
What an incredible deep dive, a man just defined by contradictions. The naturalist who championed radical action, the inventor who rejected industry, the hermit whose philosophy changed the world.
He was the ultimate systems thinker. He wove together ethics, biology, politics, and self-reflection. He gave us a model for living deliberately and a blueprint for resisting injustice.
We should just briefly touch on his final days. He'd suffered from tuberculosis for years, and his health really declined after 1860. But his friends all noted his calm acceptance of it.
He was completely at peace. When his Aunt Louisa asked him if he'd made his peace with God, he famously said, "I did not know we had ever quarreled."
He died on May 6, 1862. He was only 44. His final words were reportedly, "Now comes good sailing,"
followed by just two loaned utterances: Moose and Indian. A poet, a surveyor, a radical. His last thoughts were fixed on the untamed continent he spent his life observing.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. Thoreau rarely traveled far from home, physically, but he was an insatiable traveler in his reading, and he gave us this powerful aphorism, live at home like a traveler.
So we encourage you to apply that mindset to your own life. You don't need to quit your job and move to a cabin. The question is, what new discoveries, what new ecology, what new truths are waiting right there in your most familiar environment? If you just stop and look at them with the deliberate, rigorous intensity of Henry David Thoreau.
Look at home, but look like a traveler. That's the deepest dive you can take.
Until next time.